Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Wish Eater by Claire Luana, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Baumai. Elodie was surrounded by movement and color and light. The parade was a riot of rich hues, each wagon adorned with an embarrassment of flowers cascading over its wooden sides. The Baumai celebration in her little town of Lunasburg was growing more elaborate each year, more blooms, more drink, and certainly more carousing as the sun slipped out of sight. Elodie understood. It was the beginning of summer, a time of warmth and plenty, promise and coupling. It would take a heart of stone to greet this joyous season with anything but a hearty welcome. Elodie pressed one hand to her chest in a vain attempt to banish the heavy feeling nestled there. "Give the wee ones a smile," Elodie's mentor Agath called to her over Maven's tan haunches. "We're almost to the church." They walked on either side of the cart horse, Agath holding the reins in her firm but gnarled fingers, turning him up the narrow cobblestone street that led to the village center. They would soon pass over the Weiss River that snaked through the center of town, glistening like a satin ribbon fluttering in a maiden's tresses. Elodie smiled woodenly at the schoolchildren who lined the parade route, bouncing and waving in the hopes that a stray piece of peppermint might be flung their way. The sight of their cherubic faces and glossy curls froze her breath in her lungs. She placed a steadying hand on Maven's warm side and pulled another fistful of ivory blossoms from the cart, focusing her attentions on tossing the elegant blooms into the crowd. The flowers would be gathered with those thrown from the other wagons and woven into crowns to be worn by village girls or into nosegays to be gifted to favored lads. She herself had given Willem one of those little bouquets 5 years ago to the day. The most beautiful combination of magenta oleander and rare cerulean hollyhock, woven with mint leaves and velvety sage. They had danced until the pads of her feet had burned in her slippers, and then kissed until her heart had burned with a different kind of fire. The universe had stretched wide above them that night, every winking star a possibility, a wish waiting to come true. These days, the indifferent faces of those same stars mocked her. She could not find peace even in solitude. "You didn't have to come," Agath said softly. Elodie shook her head. "Nonsense, I'm fine. And what would people say if I didn't attend? And what would Willem do if I was not there to keep him from the bottom of the cider flagon?" "I don't give a fig what they say, and you shouldn't either." Agath's line of face was kind. Her skin was tanned and wrinkled from her days in the sun tending her garden, but her body was still strong, her tongue stronger still. Her hair was the quicksilver of fish scales, but for a streak of snowy white at one temple. Today Agath had twisted her tresses into a crown of braids decorated with baby's breath, a look favored by little girls, and not entirely appropriate for an octogenarian. But Agath cared little for propriety. Sometimes Elodie envied her that. Their conversation was forgotten as Maven made the final turn into Lunasburg's main square. Their town was undeniably lovely. Quaint, half-timbered buildings crowded together in bright colors, decorated with matching lacquered shutters and windowsill flower boxes. The whole town had turned out in their finest clothing, waiting for the parade to end so the real celebration could begin. Maven trundled around the fountain at the center of the square, his bulk momentarily shadowing the graceful statue of the daughter, dipping her pitcher down for a drink. Elodie glimpsed the familiar faces of her family as she passed. Her younger sisters, Sydney and Josephine, her father Frederick. Sydney held her month-old daughter in her arms, while her older son, a rambunctious 3-year-old, sat atop his father's shoulders. Josephine smiled and waved when she caught sight of Elodie. Elodie waved back, her eyes scanning the crowd. Where was Willem? There. He leaned against a building near the back of the crowd, flanked by 2 other faces she unfortunately recognized as well, those of her mother and father-in-law. Their little town was nestled in the hills of Astria, a verdant region known for growing juicy apples, sweet cream dairy cows, and war. Umbria on the west and Freeland on the east had fought over Astria for generations. Only in the last 3 decades had they returned to Umbrian rule. Elodie's husband and his parents favored the Freeland coloring. They were broad and tall, with dark brown hair, olive skin, and eyes the color of warm chocolate. though Willem's eyes had been anything but warm lately. Agatha pulled Maven to a stop as they passed into a shady alley behind the square where the wagons from the parade were lining up for the day. Elodie grabbed 3 bundles of herbs wrapped in seafoam ribbon and followed Agatha the short way back to the main square. Before they rounded the corner, Agatha spun and grabbed Elodie's hand. She flinched in surprise. "You will get through today." Agatha's cornflower blue eyes bored into Elodie. "Of course." Elodie examined her leather slippers peeking out underneath her dress. The soles were so worn she could feel the contours of the cobblestones beneath her feet. "It's a day to celebrate." Agatha had a keen way of seeing to the heart of a person, and that insight could be inconvenient at times. She looked up and met Agatha's gaze, willing the old woman to see a show of strength, fortitude, even if she felt anything but strong inside. Finally, Agatha nodded once, releasing Elodie's hand. "Blessed Baumai," Agatha said, offering the traditional greeting for the holiday. "Baumai blessings," Elodie responded, giving Agatha a quick peck on her leathery cheek before she turned and plunged into the crowd. Elodie longed to join her sisters and father and pull her nephew Rollo up on her hip, but she directed her steps toward where she'd seen Willem and his parents. A wife's place was with her husband on this day of fertility, in hopes the couple would be seen by the daughter and blessed by the goddess with a child. A surge of emotion flooded through her at the thought, and Elodie was too ashamed to name it for what it was. Bitterness. 4.5 years she and Willem had been married, 4.5 years trying to conceive. Her sister, Sydney, had married and birthed 2 children in the same time. "Blessed Baumai," Elodie said brightly, pasting on a smile as she found Willem. "Baumai blessings," Willem murmured, his eyes barely flicking to her. His handsome face was tight with pain, and he leaned against the nearby building for support. It was a bad day. After almost 5 years, Elodie could tell from the set of his jaw alone. It all came rushing back, those horrible weeks. Willem had been apprenticed to a stonemason set up to have a comfortable life and lucrative trade, until one day, a month before they were to be wed, a stone had fallen on Willem, partially crushing his hip and leg. She still remembered the agony on his face as they'd moved him, trying to save his life, his mobility. She remembered her terror at what it had meant for their lives together, but how could she leave him? Refuse to marry him after his accident? What kind of woman would that have made her? "Elodie," her mother-in-law, Eugenia, acknowledged her with a sniff. Her graying hair was pulled into a rigid bun, her marriage shawl wrapped around her as if a bracing wind bit at her rather than the sun's soft rays. Corbett, Willem's father, nodded his welcome before turning his eyes back to the church where Lunasburg's alder was taking the steps. Corbett stood nearly as tall as his son, both broad of shoulder with square jaws and strong, graceful eyebrows, but the corners of Corbett's mouth were turned down in an expression of perpetual disapproval. When Elodie had married Willem, it had astounded her how such a cheerful boy had sprung from such dour stock. These days, the similarities between father and son made her mouth go dry. "I brought a nosegay for you each," Elodie said, distracting herself as best she could from her spiraling thoughts. She handed one to Willem, who absent-mindedly tucked it in the pocket of his threadbare shirt. Eugenia took hers with a frown. "What are these sad little flowers?" Elodie struggled to keep her tone light as she replied, handing the last to Corbett. "They're not strictly flowers. Agatha and I decided we'd do herbs this year, as she's been letting me grow them in her greenhouse for cooking and healing. The blossoms are chamomile and coneflower, with holy basil and winter savory greens. If you smell them—" "Smells like medicine," Corbett said, wrinkling his nose. "Agatha, is that the strange woman you insist on working for?" Eugenia asked. "Willem, why do you let her work for that kook? She's no doubt filling her head with all sorts of strange thoughts." Elodie ground her teeth together. She worked for Agatha because the money was the only thing keeping a roof over their head, not to mention the leftover vegetables and provisions Agatha gifted Elodie had seen them through several winters. "Agatha is Lunasburg's most respected healer. This town would have lost many fine folk over the years without that kook, including—" Elodie swallowed her next words as Willem's eyes whipped to hers, his finely wrought lips pressed into a tight line. Once Elodie had dreamed of kissing those lips every night, of those lips being hers alone. God, she missed those days. Eugenia harumphed and turned back to the church. Would you like to find somewhere to sit? Elodie asked quietly, placing a hand on the small of Willem's back. He shook his head. I'm fine. Look, Elder Landry is calling for attention. Willem couldn't say their town leader's name without a tone of mocking. How that man ever beat you still astounds me, Eugenia muttered, crossing her chubby arms under her bosom. No one responded. Elodie turned to regard the figures that stood on the steps of the church. Elodie knew precisely how Dion Landry had won the election. The alderman was tall and well-built, with the reddish-blonde hair that many Astrians favored. He had the green eyes of an Umbrian and a face that must have been designed by the Allfather solely to make women's knees weak. He was charismatic and funny, and he seemed surprisingly competent. The contest between him and Willem had been hardly a battle at all. Perhaps the Willem she had once known could have bested Dion Landry. Her Willem had been just as cocky and charming and genuine, with the innate confidence of a man who knew the world could be his. But that had all changed after his accident. Welcome all, welcome summer, Elder Landry called out in his smooth baritone, his arms open wide. His suit was made of well-tailored tan wool, no doubt new for this year. Elodie resisted looking down at her own jade dress, the same she'd worn the last 2 years, and tried not to think of how different their lives would have been if Willem had won the eldership. Dion's wife, Delphine, stood next to him, her thick brunette hair pulled into a braid over one shoulder, her hands demurely resting on her extremely pregnant stomach. On her other side stood Justice Gregoire, in his white robes, the triangle of the church hanging from the gold chain about his neck. Elodie tried to focus on the alder's words, then on those of Justice Gregoire, but she'd heard them all so many times before. Thanking the Allfather for bringing them through another winter, honoring the Allfather's daughter for blessing them with new life, new unions, banishing the unbrother, the Allfather's wicked sibling, who sought to mar their happiness with curses and trickery. Soon it would be time to name the Baumai queen, a tradition she had delighted in as a girl, and which she now dreaded with every fiber of her being. Her eyes slid over the crowd bordering the church steps and stopped as her gaze met another. Sebastian Beringer, the owner of the town's largest apple farm and new cider brewery. He was a handsome man, with golden hair and the loveliest hazel eyes ringed with blue. He was kind, too. She worked for him some days tending his trees when they showed sign of ailment, and he'd hired Willem for the picking season, paying him the same wages even though he was slower than the other men. She smiled, and Sebastian answered with his own before turning back to the church. He must have been scanning the crowd just as she. And now it's time to crown our new Baumai queen. Let those married ladies hoping for blessings this year come forward, Elder Landry announced. Elodie stayed frozen to her spot, her feet as heavy as stone. It was elegantly said, but everyone knew what the elder meant. Married women who wanted children. They would gather and each select a berry tart, biting into it. Baked inside one of the tarts was a little wooden stork, the symbol of Astria and a sign of fertility. Legend said the woman selected as Baumai queen would have a baby in her arms the following spring, which Elodie knew was a load of horse manure, as she'd been selected 2 years ago, and her womb was still as empty as her pantry. Elodie, her mother-in-law's voice cut through her troubled thoughts. Why do you not go? I thought maybe I'd skip this year, she managed, wishing the stones would swallow her up. To stand out there before their town for another year without even a swell in her belly. It was to bear her greatest shame to everyone she knew. You selfish girl, Eugenia snapped, making Elodie recoil. You don't even ask for the daughter's blessing? You will deprive us of our only chance to have a grandchild because you cannot be troubled to walk across the square? Go and pray the daughter did not see your disrespect. Elodie's feet were moving before the force of Eugenia's words truly hit her. She stumbled into the center of the square, falling in with the other married women who were clothed in pastel dresses and crowned in flowers. Most she knew. She offered them smiles even as her thoughts raged within her. Was she selfish to seek respite from this horrible tradition? To avoid having her failures paraded before her in the guise of a celebration? But perhaps she was being too proud, and needed to humble herself before the daughter? It wasn't about her, after all. It was about the joy of bringing new life into this world. She was willing to do anything, to try anything, if it meant she would be a mother, even if it felt like she'd already tried everything 100 times over. Elodie's thoughts consumed her as the tray of tarts passed from hand to hand, as she took one topped with a pastry rose. As she took a bite and felt her teeth make contact with the undeniable wood of a stork.